He gave everything for his country blood-time brothers he never got to bury. But when the war ended, another one began. This time, the battlefield was home. And the enemy A system that turned its back. They said he was guilty. They took his freedom. And they took his dog, but what they didn't take was loyalty. Marley, a retired military K-9, vanished from a training center one night and began a journey no one believed was possible. Hundreds of miles. Alone. Silent. Until he lay down at the gates of a prison and waited. What happened next will make you cry and believe in miracles again. Before we begin, tell me, do you have a dog of your own? Drop their name in the comments. I'd love to know who's watching beside their best friend. The humid air of Savannah, Georgia, clung to the sidewalks like a memory that wouldn't fade. The Spanish moss draped lazily from the live oaks, swaying in the warm breeze that drifted in from the Atlantic. It was mid-September, and the sky above was a dull, unchanging gray, a kind of heaviness that matched the quiet that often followed returning soldiers. Ethan Walker stepped out of his rusted pickup truck and adjusted the strap of his canvas medical bag over his shoulder. His posture was too straight for a civilian street, his every movement controlled as if waiting for an explosion that would never come. Ethan was 36 tall and broad-shouldered, with the compact build of a man who had spent years running toward gunfire rather than away from it. His short-cropped, dark brown hair was peppered with premature gray near the temples, and his jawline bore a faint scar just beneath the chin, a remnant of shrapnel in Kandahar. His eyes, once a vivid green, now seemed dulled like glass left out in the sun too long. He walked with the silence of a medic who had learned that rushing could kill and listening could save. At his side trotted Marley, a German shepherd with a deep golden coat streaked with black saddle markings. Marley was 6 years old, with intelligent amber eyes that missed nothing, a small notch in his left ear from a desert op and a tail that rarely wagged except for one person, Ethan. He moved with the precision of a military-trained K-9, each step in tune with his partner's. But in Savannah, far from battlefields and dust storms, he seemed to move not as a tool of war, but as something gentler, a guardian. They made their way into the brick building that housed the Veteran Affairs Clinic. Ethan volunteered here 3 days a week, tending to veterans whose wounds were buried deeper than skin. He was not a licensed doctor in the civilian world, but his hands had held dying men, and his presence alone often calmed those who came in restless trembling or too quiet for too long. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. The receptionist, Mrs. Connie Marks, gave a tired smile from behind the counter. She was in her late 50s, short and round, with hair dyed the color of copper pennies and glasses that always slid to the tip of her nose. "Morning, Ethan. Marley," she said. "You're early. Better early than late," Ethan replied, voice gravel. Low. He stopped by room 3, where a man named Alan Riggs, Vietnam vet, 74, mostly blind, sat in a chair, muttering to himself about phantom helicopters. Ethan knelt and placed a hand on Alan's shoulder. "You're safe here, sir," he said. "Marley's here too." Marley sat at attention, then gently nudged his head under Alan's trembling hand. The older man sighed, almost smiling. After the session, Ethan didn't go home. He drove 15 minutes down to the outskirts of town, past the peeling paint and sun-faded Baptist churches, to a small assisted living facility called Silver Pines. The nurses here knew him by name. They also knew not to startle his father. Reverend Thomas Walker had been a pastor for nearly 40 years, a man once known for his booming sermons and gentleness with children. Now he sat in a wheelchair near the window of room 12, staring at the trees. His body was frail skin, mottled and thin, but his hands still looked like they belonged on a pulpit, strong, calloused, always folded in prayer. He rarely spoke these days, and when he did, it was to people who weren't there. Ethan entered quietly, and Marley went straight to the old man's feet. Without a word, Thomas reached down and let his fingers curl into the fur at Marley's neck. His breathing, which had been shallow and uneven, steadied. Ethan sat across from him just watching. He remembers the dog said Nurse Dana, a tall black woman with kind eyes and long dreadlocks tied in a colorful scarf. Even when he forgets you. Ethan nodded. That's all right. Marley remembers enough for both of us. They stayed there for over an hour. Thomas didn't speak, but he didn't let go either. When it was time to go, Marley stood reluctantly, casting one last glance back before following Ethan out. That night, back in the small apartment Ethan rented above an old record store, he sat at the kitchen table staring at a half-finished meal. Marley lay curled under the table, eyes open. Ethan had taken off his boots but hadn't touched the food. The ticking of the clock on the wall filled the space. "You think we're healing?" Ethan asked softly. Marley's ears flicked, but he said nothing. He never needed to. Ethan reached down and rested a hand on the dog's back. "Sometimes I feel like we left the war, but it didn't leave us." In his dreams that night, the gunfire returned. But so did Marley, rushing through smoke and sand, finding him, anchoring him. Always finding him. The sun broke late over Savannah that morning, filtered through thick clouds that hovered low and heavy. A fine drizzle laced the city, barely more than mist enough to leave a chill on the skin and smear the horizon into a dull gray blur. Ethan Walker stood at the edge of a rain-dampened sidewalk outside the old Port District, the brick beneath his boots slick with moisture. Marley sat beside him, still, as ever nose lifted slightly to the wind ears alert. The summons had come the day before. Military police. No warning, no explanation. Just a letter sealed in an envelope that hadn't been touched by human hands, only by process bureaucracy and something colder. Ethan hadn't worn his uniform in months, but this morning he had put on his old Army field jacket out of instinct. It still fit, still bore the ghost of sand and diesel in its seams. Inside the Federal Operations Building, the walls were all cinder block and silence. Ethan sat alone in a steel chair across from two investigators in civilian clothes. The older one introduced himself as Agent Ron Halbrook, mid-50s, pale with thinning red hair and a jaw that looked permanently clenched. The younger was Lieutenant Sarah Dunn, a woman in her 30s with a tight brown bun and sharp features that suggested both competence and exhaustion. Her olive skin was flushed slightly from the cold, and her voice didn't rise above neutral even once. Sergeant Walker Halbrook began steepling his fingers. "We're reopening the file on Operation Dust Veil, specifically the incident that occurred at Grid Point 9, the warehouse facility outside Kandahar." Ethan didn't blink. "That was 18 months ago. Long enough for things to resurface," Dunn replied. "We have new information. Testimony, communications logs." "What kind of information?" Ethan asked. Halbrook opened a folder and slid a single printed page across the table. At the top was a grainy satellite image of a burned-out warehouse. In the lower corner, a timestamp was visible, one that Ethan remembered well. The night Corporal Devin Madsen died. "You're being accused," Dunn said flatly, "of facilitating an unauthorized weapons transfer, arms meant for local forces. The prosecution believes you pocketed funds and orchestrated the cover-up. That night, Madsen was shot in the crossfire. They're saying you pulled the trigger." Ethan's mouth went dry. "That's a lie. Prove it," Halbrook said simply. "Because the surveillance footage from the forward drone feed. It's missing. The server logs were wiped 2 hours after the incident. The comms archive is corrupted." Ethan's voice came slow. "You think I killed my own man for what money? That's what this is." Dunn's expression shifted slightly, the barest hesitation in her eyes. You're to report for arraignment next week. A dishonorable discharge is already pending." When Ethan stepped outside an hour later, Marley was waiting by the door, pacing. The moment he saw Ethan, he trotted forward and bumped his head against his handler's leg, as if sensing the storm before it broke. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The rain had returned with more force, tapping against the window pane in a ceaseless rhythm. He sat at his kitchen table going through old mission logs, photos, commendations. A letter from Madson's mother was tucked into one of the folders. "He always said you were the only reason he made it through deployment." He closed the file. The knock came the next morning. Jack Monroe was 28 tall and thin, with rolled-up sleeves, a crooked pair of glasses, and hair that perpetually looked like he'd just walked through a storm. He carried a leather satchel slung over one shoulder and introduced himself with a firm handshake and a disarming tone. "Ethan Walker. I'm with the Savannah Ledger. You probably don't want to talk to me." Ethan leaned against the doorframe. "Then why are you here?" "Because something doesn't make sense," Jack said. "And I make a living following things that don't add up." Ethan said nothing. "I covered Dustvale," Jack continued, "was embedded for 2 weeks. I saw how you operated. You don't fit the profile. And the records, they're full of holes, reports filed late, comms wiped, camera feeds missing. The whole unit's been scattered." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "You went digging." Jack nodded. "I'm not here to clear your name. I'm here to find the truth. If that happens to help you, so be it." Ethan stepped back and opened the door. "Come in." Over black coffee and toast, no one ate. Ethan answered every question Jack had. They pulled up satellite maps, old mission timelines, weapon movement manifests. Jack jotted everything down, quickly focused. At one point, Marley padded over and placed his head in Jack's lap. The reporter froze. "He doesn't usually do that," Ethan murmured. Jack ran a hand gently over the dog's fur. "Guess he knows I'm not lying." When Jack left, he made a promise. "If someone's hiding something, I'll find it. I don't care who they are." The next day, the charges were made public. Ethan's name flooded local news. His face was plastered on headlines beside the words "suspected traitor." The military revoked his clearance. His bank account was frozen. Marley's registration as a working dog was suspended. Letters came, some of support, most not. And through it all, Ethan stood still. "I don't know what they're after," he told Marley as they stood in the quiet of the backyard under a sky splitting open with thunder, "but I'm not going down for something I didn't do." Marley pressed close, the rain beginning to fall between them. The clink of chains and the low echo of reinforced doors marked the end of Ethan Walker's freedom. Sentenced to life in federal prison without parole, he stepped from the courthouse to a transport van, wrists shackled, the roar of distant protests muffled behind thick glass. Savannah's sky, usually painted in warm watercolor hues, had turned iron gray. No sun, no light. Just the scent of rain-soaked concrete and the hollow silence of betrayal. Marley had not been allowed in the courtroom. Ethan hadn't even gotten to say goodbye. When they came for Marley, it was clinical. 2 officers from the Department of Defense's K-9 division arrived with standard transport gear, no emotion. They presented a form stating that Marley, as government property, was to be reassigned for retraining and evaluation at the Fort Alden K-9 Tactical Center in Atlanta. He was muzzled and lifted into the back of the van. He didn't resist. But he didn't make eye contact either. The facility in Atlanta sat behind 2 layers of fencing and guard towers nestled near a disused airfield. Meant to house and rehabilitate K-9s no longer fit for deployment, it operated under strict military structure, clean, orderly, efficient. But for dogs like Marley, the walls were as confining as any human prison. Marley was placed in Kennel 12, a spacious pen with a cot food and water bowls and a small open yard attached. Most dogs adjusted within a few days. Marley did not. He didn't eat the dry food placed in his bowl. He didn't play with the rope toy looped around the cot frame. He lay curled near the far corner of the pen facing the wall. During the day, he responded to no commands. At night, he howled long, mournful wails that rose just as the sirens from the nearby city rolled across the landscape. The other dogs barked in confusion or agitation, but Marley's sound was different. Not fear, not rage, grief. Trainer Sarah Lindell noticed him on her second day back after medical leave. She was a tall woman in her early 40s with narrow shoulders and long limbs that moved deliberately, like someone who had learned not to waste energy. Her hair was always tied back in a low knot, and her face bore the kind of stillness that came only from loss. A faint scar ran down her left temple, partially hidden by the strands of auburn hair she never bothered to dye. She wore the standard olive-green fatigues, but her demeanor was more healer than soldier. Sarah had seen her share of troubled canines, aggressive ones, shut-down ones, anxious ones. But this dog, he was different. There was no fear in his posture, no aggression, just an eerie stillness. His eyes were alert but withdrawn, like he was watching a world she couldn't see. She stopped outside Kennel 12 and crouched. "You're not here," she whispered. "You're still with him, aren't you?" She checked his intake file. Name Marley, age 6. Deployment Afghanistan, Iraq. Handler Sergeant Ethan Walker. She frowned. She had heard the name Walker. The soldier sentenced last week. She didn't read the articles, but headlines had lingered across the news cycle, decorated medic turned traitor. Sarah had learned a long time ago not to trust headlines. Later that afternoon, she stepped into the kennel with slow movements. Marley didn't move. She set a bowl of wet food near him. "You don't have to trust me," she said. "Just stay alive long enough to find a reason." For the next week, she came every morning. Always the same soft voice, no direct contact, just presence. She sat in the dirt some days reading out loud from a book. It was a habit she'd picked up after losing Scout, her first rescue dog, years ago. Scout had been found chained in a junkyard, half-starved with eyes that didn't blink for days. It had taken Sarah 3 months to earn a tail wag. On the 10th day, Marley finally sniffed the wet food. On the 11th, he ate half. By the 14th, he sat up when she approached. But he never barked, never wagged, and at night the howling continued. Meanwhile, Ethan adapted to his new life with mechanical obedience. Wake up, eat, work, lights out. His cell at the Pine Ridge Federal Correctional Facility was clean, small, and suffocating. He didn't speak unless spoken to. Inmates gave him space, some because they recognized the soldier in him, others because of what the papers had said. At night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if Marley was still alive, if he hated him now. He replayed the last mission again and again, trying to find where it went wrong. He remembered Madsen's voice over comms, the silence after the shot, the blood, the corrupted file, and the realization someone had wiped it clean. Jack Monroe had written him once. The letter was held by the prison's review board for a week before it reached him. Inside was a single line, "Still digging. Still. I don't believe them either." Ethan burned the letter after reading it only because it hurt less than hoping. The storm rolled in just after midnight. Atlanta's sky cracked open with a jagged fork of lightning bathing the compound of Fort Alden K-9 Tactical Center in sudden electric blue. Rain hammered the tin roof with relentless force. Most of the dogs had retreated into their kennels, tails tucked, ears pinned. But in Kennel 12, Marley stood at the far gate, unmoving, his eyes fixed not on the lightning, but on something only he could sense, an unseen thread pulling him beyond the wire. Sarah Lindell had forgotten to double-check the west perimeter gate that evening. It wasn't negligence, just exhaustion. She had worked 3 shifts that week, and her mind was drifting to Scout again, the dog she had lost years before in a highway accident that still visited her in dreams. She'd meant to walk back and test the latch after feeding time. But the power flickered, the radio cracked with storm updates, and she'd gone home early, promising herself she'd fix it in the morning. Marley didn't hesitate. The loose corner of the chain-link fence gave way with a soft creak, and he was through, moving low to the ground body, close to the dirt. The thunder masked his exit. He crossed the outer fence line in under 2 minutes, navigated through a gap behind the supply shed, and slipped into the trees beyond without alerting a single guard. By the time the motion sensors registered movement, he was already half a mile down the service road. The rain came harder now, thick sheets blurring his path. But Marley ran with precision. He did not wander. He did not pause. The map lived in his muscles, every highway curve, every turn, stitched into memory from training runs and night missions. He was headed southeast toward Savannah, toward Ethan. 2 days passed. Marley stayed off the main roads when he could, skirting chain-link fences, dipping through irrigation canals, sleeping beneath overturned dumpsters and loading docks. Hunger gnawed at his ribs, but he scavenged what he could, half a burger outside a diner, rainwater from a pothole, a piece of bread dropped at a gas station parking lot. The news broke on the 3rd day. A boy named Noah Daniels, 9 years old, had wandered from a picnic site near Statesboro during a family outing. He had chased a paper airplane across a field and slipped into a drainage ditch swollen with storm runoff. His cries for help were lost in the wind until Marley, drawn by sound or something deeper, found him wedged between a culvert and a sheet of rusted metal, his ankle-trapped water rising. Marley moved without fear. He slid down the embankment, braced his body beside the boy, and began digging at the loose gravel. Noah, shivering and crying, clutched the dog's neck, and Marley remained pressed against him, shielding him from the current. 20 minutes later, a passing cyclist saw the commotion and called 911. By the time emergency crews arrived, Marley had dislodged enough dirt to free the boy's leg and was dragging him to the shallow bank. The paramedic who pulled them out, Tessa Coleman, mid-30s athletic build, close-cropped blonde hair, snapped a photo of the dog as she wrapped Noah in a thermal blanket. Marley was covered in grime, soaked, panting, but calm. Tessa, a former Army nurse herself, recognized the look in his eyes. "That dog's not just wandering," she murmured. "He's going somewhere." The photo, captioned "Unknown Hero," went viral in hours. Marley vanished again before animal control arrived. He was spotted on a roadside camera near Metter the next morning, trotting steadily along the shoulder of Highway 80. A trucker saw him leap a guardrail and vanish into woods. A farmer near Brooklet found him drinking from a horse trough and tried to lure him in with bacon, but Marley darted through the corn rows and disappeared. By now, local news stations were covering the hero dog making his way through Georgia. Reporters speculated he was heading home, though no one could confirm where home was. The Department of Defense declined to comment. At the Fort Alden Center, Sarah Lindell stood in front of Marley's empty kennel heart pounding. She had seen the photo. She recognized the stance, the posture, even the stubborn determination in his muddy eyes. Marley was no longer lost. He was following something older than orders, something sacred. "He's going back to his soldier," she whispered. Back in Savannah, Ethan hadn't seen the news. Federal prison didn't allow live broadcasts, but he felt something unexplainable, a gnawing tightness in his chest, a sensation that pressed at him whenever he closed his eyes. At night, he dreamed of footfalls echoing outside a chain-link fence, of paws moving through mud, of breath fogging in the rain. And Marley kept going. By day 5, he was limping one paw tender from a splinter he couldn't dislodge, but he pressed on, crossing through a church parking lot in Pooler, ducking beneath a rusted gate. A woman named Carolyn Mathers, 60, widowed and kind-eyed, tried to call to him as he passed her garden, but he never slowed. She later told reporters it was like he was on a mission, like nothing else in the world mattered. She was right. Savannah's winter rain was a quiet grief, steady, colorless, and constant. It fell across the red brick of the Pine Ridge Federal Correctional Facility like a shroud. Street lamps cast pale halos on the wet pavement outside the main gate, their glow dancing across the puddles that had pooled along the chain-link perimeter. The guards, used to solitude and silence beyond the razor wire, began to murmur to one another about a presence they couldn't explain. Marley had arrived. It was a Tuesday evening when Officer Derek Paxton first saw him, a large German shepherd, soaked and shivering, sitting like a statue at the corner of the outer lot. Paxton was in his late 40s, barrel-chested with a salt and pepper buzz cut, and a stitched-up scar above his right eye that gave him a permanent look of skepticism. He'd served as a corrections officer for 20 years and didn't believe in signs. But there was something about the dog that halted him mid-step. Marley didn't bark. He didn't growl or whine. He simply lay down in the mud and stared at the gates. That night he didn't leave, nor did he leave the next, or the next after that. Word spread quickly. Prison staff began bringing scraps, boiled chicken dry biscuits, bits of jerky. Marley took none of it. He drank from the shallow puddle near the fence and curled into himself at dusk, ignoring the cold. When the rain turned to sleet, he remained in place, eyes fixed on the same point as if willing the metal gate to dissolve. Inside the prison, Ethan Walker sat on the edge of his cot, knuckles white around a worn-out Bible. His father's Bible. The edges of the pages had begun to curl, and most of the gold lettering was gone from the spine. Ethan hadn't spoken to many since his conviction. He was labeled a traitor by some, forgotten by others. But there were moments, flashes, when he felt something just beyond the walls, like breath pressed to glass. He couldn't explain it, not even to the chaplain. But every night that week he had the same dream pause striking pavement, the faint rustle of wet fur and eyes like molten amber beneath a streetlight. 15 miles away, Jack Monroe stared at his laptop screen, heart hammering. Jack was 31, gangly and pale, with dark curly hair that never cooperated, and an intensity that often unnerved his peers. He wrote for The Lantern, a regional investigative outlet, barely surviving on donations and grit. Jack hadn't expected Marley's story to take him here into the depths of military data architecture. But when he followed the breadcrumb trail from the viral dog rescue back to the soldier's name tagged in comments, he began digging. Then came the email. It was anonymous. A single line in the subject. They'd changed the logs. Attached was a raw audit log from a now archived military server used during Operation Morning Sky, the botched mission that had ended in one soldier's death and Ethan's disgrace. The log entries, dated and time-stamped, didn't match the official report submitted to the military tribunal. A key file containing drone surveillance had been modified nearly 40 minutes after it was allegedly uploaded, meaning it had been altered after the event. Jack cross-referenced it with metadata recovered from a separate cloud mirror, and the discrepancy became undeniable. Someone had tampered with the digital evidence. The surveillance had been doctored. As Marley's story continued to spread, his image now, front page on the Savannah Sentinel under the headline, "Loyal to the End, Who Is He Waiting For?" Jack prepared his exposé. He wasn't alone. Across town, Sarah Lindell watched the same news clip from her modest one-bedroom apartment. She wore a threadbare gray hoodie, her reddish-blonde hair tied back in a fraying ponytail. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep. Ever since Marley disappeared, guilt had curled itself around her ribs like ivy. But when she saw the video, the dog lying outside the prison gate, eyes alert, she knew. She hadn't lost him. He had gone where he was needed most. On the 6th night, the warden took notice. Warden Thomas Bray was a tall man, with a military-bearing skin the color of sand, clean-shaven with deep creases around his mouth that hinted at a man unaccustomed to laughter. He peered through the surveillance monitor, then looked out the window himself. The dog was there. Again. "He's back," muttered Officer Paxton beside him. The warden didn't answer. His eyes lingered on Marley's shape for a long time before he finally said, "Let him be." The prison chaplain, Father Lowell, an aging man with gentle eyes and a slight stoop, told Ethan 2 days later. "There's a dog outside the gate," he said during their weekly visit. "Big fella. Been sleeping out there a week now. Someone said he saved a kid on his way here." Ethan's throat tightened. He didn't need to ask what color his fur was or the shape of his ears. He already knew. That night, Ethan whispered one word into the dark, barely audible above the hum of the ventilation system. Marley. The morning began not with sun, but with the hush of gray clouds over Savannah, like the heavens themselves were holding their breath. Damp wind threaded through the columns of the federal courthouse, rattling flags on their poles and sending jackets flapping as crowds gathered in the square. Reporters huddled beneath umbrellas, camera crews adjusted lenses, and volunteers handed out coffee from thermoses near the back steps. But none of them spoke loudly. Today, silence carried weight. Inside courtroom 3B, Jack Monroe sat with his knees bouncing and palms slick, his press badge crooked on the lapel of his faded blazer. Beside him sat Ava Tran, the anonymous technician who had stepped forward only days prior. She was in her early 30s, Vietnamese-American, slim with high cheekbones and sharp brown eyes behind thick glasses. She wore a plain navy cardigan and black jeans, her laptop balanced on her knees like armor. Despite her quiet voice and nervous posture, her testimony had shaken the court. They'd presented the tampered metadata, the discrepancies in timestamp logs, and the suspicious deletion of backup surveillance. Ava's background in cybersecurity and her brief contract work on the military base gave her authority, but it was the simple way she said he was framed that made the room still. She didn't know Ethan, but the facts she laid bare spoke louder than any plea. Judge Margaret Whitmore sat at the bench, her spine ramrod straight in her black robes. She was in her early 60s, silver hair pinned back tightly, but her eyes, storm gray and sharp, were restless. Known for her impartiality and no-nonsense demeanor, she had listened for hours, with a face carved from stone. But as Jack read aloud the section of the military report that was falsified to mask another soldier's command error, something shifted in her gaze. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her gavel. Ethan Walker stood between two federal marshals, hands free. For the first time in over a year, his face gaunt but composed. His army haircut had grown into disarray, dark brown with hints of gray at the temples. His eyes, though tired, held a steady burn, as if he had learned how to live with fire without being consumed. He wore a borrowed gray button-up shirt and black slacks too loose on his tall frame. The badge of dishonor on his military record had felt like a branding iron. Today, that iron was cooling. The courtroom was hushed as Judge Whitmore looked directly at him. In light of newly submitted evidence, she said, her voice quieter than anyone expected, and pending the results of further investigation into the integrity of the original prosecution, this court hereby grants conditional release for Ethan James Walker, effective immediately. The gavel struck once, and then she paused. Her lips parted as if to say more, but instead she blinked rapidly, reached for a tissue, and looked away. Outside, the crowd surged forward as news spread. Marley had been there since dawn, lying by the courthouse steps with his head on his paws, unmoving, despite the shuffle of boots and camera crews. He looked thinner than before, still strong but weathered. His golden-brown fur was damp with dew, and his left ear had a small tear from an encounter on the road. Yet his posture remained proud eyes trained on the double doors. When those doors opened, Ethan stepped into the daylight for the first time in 15 months. He paused. There, only 20 feet away, Marley stood up. There was no hesitation, no dramatic barking, just movement, pure, instinctual, wordless movement. Marley walked forward, slow at first, then faster, as if he couldn't believe it was truly happening. Ethan dropped to one knee, arms open, and before he could speak, Marley launched himself into his chest. Cameras clicked. Reporters gasped. But in that moment, the world faded away. Ethan buried his face in Marley's damp fur, the scent of soil and rain, and something old and familiar. Marley let out a soft, broken whine, then went limp in Ethan's arms, as if every muscle had waited for this. His tail thumped twice, then fell still, and he simply rested there as if no place on earth could be safer. He waited, Ethan whispered. All this time, you waited. The live stream footage caught every second. It aired nationwide within the hour. People from coast to coast watched the soldier embrace his dog, tears falling as if washing away not just months of grief, but years of silence, trauma, and falsehood. From her apartment, Sarah Lindell watched it all unfold. Her freckled cheeks were streaked with tears, but she smiled. She had seen dogs wait before, dogs with hearts too big for the world, but never like this. She reached for her phone and sent a simple message to Jack. Tell him. Marley never gave up. Jack, standing off to the side near the courthouse pillar, read the message and looked over at Ethan and Marley surrounded by reporters. He didn't move forward. He didn't need to. This was their moment. Judge Whitmore, watching from her private chamber through the narrow window, exhaled a single breath that trembled on her lips. In the weeks that followed, the legal system would begin its slow turn toward justice. But in that square, under a silver sky, something louder than law had already spoken. Autumn had arrived in Savannah like a hush settling over a long, chaotic conversation. The gold leaves of Forsyth Park rustled gently under a copper sky, the air holding that crisp stillness only October could bring. Ethan Walker stood beneath a sycamore tree near the park's fountain, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes half closed as Marley sat quietly beside him. The wind tugged at the hem of Ethan's wool coat, and Marley's ears flicked at the distant sound of traffic, but neither moved. They were waiting not for anyone this time, but simply breathing in the quiet that had taken so long to earn. Ethan was free, fully exonerated. The official ruling had come through 2 weeks earlier, after a military tribunal reviewed the evidence Jack Monroe and Ava Tran had unearthed. The charges were overturned, the dishonorable discharge erased from his record, and an official apology, sterile, bureaucratic, too late, was issued by the Department of Defense. But Ethan hadn't attended the press conference. Instead, he spent that day with Marley and his father, reading aloud psalms from the old leather-bound Bible the pastor had carried in his youth. His father, James Walker, was slipping further into the fog of dementia. Once a towering figure in the community, Pastor Walker now spent his days mostly in silence, eyes lost to memory, fingers twitching over phantom pages of long-forgotten sermons. On good days, he would look up and smile when Marley entered the room. On the best days, he'd call Ethan by name. But most days, it was the touch of Marley's head on his knee that brought any flicker of recognition. After Ethan's release, he didn't seek reinstatement in the military. The wounds ran too deep, the betrayal too sharp. But he also didn't disappear. Instead, he began spending time at the Savannah Veterans Center not as a patient but as a volunteer. It started small, bringing Marley in to visit the long-term care wing, sitting with amputees who had stopped speaking, letting Marley lay his head on laps grown thin with time. But it didn't stop there. Dr. Rebecca Stanton, the head counselor at the center, was a short, broad-shouldered woman in her late 40s, with a voice like gravel and eyes that missed nothing. She wore earth-tone sweaters and heavy boots, and her thick brown hair was always tied in a no-nonsense braid. A Gulf War vet herself, she recognized trauma not by words, but by the way a man's foot tapped without rhythm, or how someone flinched at the buzz of fluorescent lights. When she saw Ethan speaking softly to a Marine who hadn't made eye contact in 6 months, she asked if he'd consider training. Ethan didn't answer right away, but a week later he began the coursework to become a licensed PTSD counselor. The process took nearly a year, and he worked part-time at a hardware store to cover the bills while studying. Jack Monroe stayed in touch the whole time, checking in every few weeks, mostly with texts that said things like, "Still writing," "Still thinking of that photo." Jack's feature article, "The Dog Who Waited for a Soldier," had run in the Atlantic, then been picked up by nearly every major outlet. It had gone viral for its powerful contrast, a military institution that broke its own, and a dog who never left his soldier behind. Photos of Marley lying outside the prison gates had become a symbol printed on T-shirts, murals, bumper stickers. For the first time in years, Ethan's name wasn't spoken with suspicion. It was spoken with reverence. But he rarely mentioned the article. Instead, he focused on building something. The therapy group began with just 3 men, 2 Vietnam veterans and a young woman named Tanya Harper, an Iraq war medic with a haunted stare and a tattoo that ran down her arm in Persian script. Marley would lay in the center of the circle while Ethan facilitated, and sometimes when the words were too hard to speak, the vets would just stroke Marley's fur until the silence loosened. Ethan didn't try to fix anyone. He simply listened. And in that space, healing began. Eventually, Ethan and Marley founded Anchor Point, a K-9 assisted trauma recovery program. They trained rescue dogs, mostly German Shepherds, Labradors, and Retrievers, to become therapy companions for veterans dealing with combat-related PTSD. Sarah Lindell, the trainer from the Atlanta Canine Center, moved to Savannah to help lead the initiative. She brought her own rescue dog, Moses, a one-eyed Labrador, who'd once been scheduled for euthanasia, but now played the role of comic relief at every session. Sarah was in her mid-30s, tall and wiry, with curly auburn hair, always tucked under a ball cap, and a fierce commitment to her work. She rarely spoke about her own past, though everyone knew she'd lost her brother in Afghanistan. That loss, and the rescue of Moses during a rough patch in her life, had made her both tender and tough in equal measure. Each morning, Ethan and Marley arrived at the center just before 8 a.m. Marley, now older and with silver creeping across his muzzle, would walk with purpose through the halls, tail wagging, low eyes still bright. His limp from a hip injury had worsened, but he never missed a session. The vets called him Doc Marley, and even when he didn't move much, his presence did more than any medication. One particular morning, Jack Monroe stopped by with a surprise. He carried a large framed photograph under his arm and a grin that made Ethan suspicious. He handed it over without explanation. Inside the frame was the now famous image, Marley soaked and solemn, staring through the prison gates under a stormy sky. Beneath it, etched in brass, was the quote, "He didn't wait because he had to. He waited because love remembers." Ethan didn't speak for a long time. But that evening he hung it in the main therapy room where the new recruits would see it every day as they walked in, dogs and veterans alike. The sun rose slowly over the outskirts of Savannah, where fog clung to the earth like memory to a scar. On a quiet piece of land near the Ojichi River, the morning mist curled around the wooden gates of a new kind of sanctuary, one not built for glory or war, but for healing. The sign above the entrance read, "Marley's Haven." It wasn't large, it didn't need to be, but it was sacred ground for those who had carried burdens too heavy to name. Every morning, just before 7, a golden-brown figure limped across the gravel path and settled at the gate. Marley, now well into his 12th year, had grown gray around the muzzle, and the stiffness in his hips made each step deliberate. Yet still, he came every morning, rain or shine. He would sit beneath the wooden archway, head lifted, ears alert, waiting, watching, greeting the dogs who arrived in the vans and the people who came to meet them, as if, in his mind, the mission was never over, only transformed. Ethan Walker emerged from the main house mug of black coffee in hand, hoodie zipped halfway up. His hair had grown a little longer, the lines around his eyes a little deeper, but his posture carried something steadier now. Not military precision, but purpose. He walked slowly toward Marley and crouched beside him, resting a hand on his old partner's back. "Still on duty," he murmured. Marley thumped his tail, once slow and faithful. Marley's Haven had been Ethan's dream for months, no, for years, though he hadn't known it at first. The idea came in pieces during therapy sessions when a veteran's eyes softened as they stroked a dog's ear, or when a retired K9 whimpered in its sleep, tail twitching in phantom memories of battlefields. Ethan saw it again and again. Trauma didn't only reside in human souls. It lived in the hearts of dogs, too. The center was built with donated funds, many from readers moved by Jack Monroe's article, some from local veterans groups, and a generous grant from an anonymous benefactor. The land was a retired peach orchard, its trees still blooming in early spring, their fruit now feeding the volunteers who helped maintain the property. Sarah Lindell had taken over as director of canine training. She moved like someone who carried invisible weights, with grace, her tall frame always in motion but never hurried. Her curls were usually tucked under a ball cap with the Marley's Haven logo, and she kept a whistle around her neck and a treat pouch on her hip. She didn't just train dogs, she listened to them. Under her care, even the most withdrawn rescues eventually learned to trust again. There was Buck, a chocolate lab who flinched at every sudden movement and took weeks to accept human touch. There was Rosie, a wiry German shepherd with one eye clouded from an IED blast who now napped in the sun with Marley. And there was Tango, a young Belgian Malinois who'd been discharged after biting his handler during a panic episode. Each dog had a file. But more than that, each had a story, and Ethan made sure those stories were heard. Inside the main house, where the walls were lined with photos of service animals, there was a room called the Honor Hall. In the center hung a single frame, the photo of Marley sitting outside the prison gates, soaked in rain, eyes locked on the place where his person waited. Beneath it, a brass plaque read, "Not every hero wears boots." The photo had traveled far. It became more than a story. It became a teaching tool. Military academies across the country had begun using Marley's journey as part of their ethics and leadership training, weaving his loyalty into discussions about duty sacrifice and emotional intelligence. Ethan had spoken at West Point, the Citadel, and several VA events, always ending his talks not with strategy, but with a simple truth. You cannot train love. But love can teach you everything. Sometimes new recruits or young officers would visit the Haven as part of their rotation. They expected something like a museum. What they found was something quieter, deeper. A sanctuary. A group of people and dogs who had known war now practicing the everyday courage of gentleness. One afternoon, a visitor arrived from out of state, a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair named Lydia Cross. She wore a navy coat and carried a framed photograph tucked under one arm. Lydia had been a military vet nurse, and her German Shepherd partner Reaper had died after saving 2 Marines in Afghanistan. She stood in the honor hall gazing at the photo of Marley and whispered, "He waited, because he knew the soul comes home." Ethan joined her quietly. "Did Reaper have a place to retire?" "No," Lydia said softly. "He died on duty. But this is what I would have wanted for him." Later that day, Ethan announced the start of a memorial garden, each stone engraved with the name of a dog who had served and passed. It became a place of silent prayer, of folded flags and slow footsteps of candles lit beneath the stars. And Marley, he aged with grace. He no longer joined the younger dogs in their romps through the orchard, but he remained the spirit of the haven, the first to greet each new arrival, the last to leave the courtyard in the evening. Volunteers joked that he was head of security, though he rarely barked. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a command and a comfort. One evening, as the sun sank low and the sky burned orange, Ethan sat beside Marley on the front porch. He rested his head against Marley's shoulder and whispered, "You brought me home, buddy. I just built the house." Marley didn't respond with movement, but his eyes closed slowly the way a soul does when it knows it is safe. In a world so quick to discard the broken dog's, soldiers' memories, Marley's journey reminds us that healing is not just possible, it's sacred. What the world saw as a retired dog and a disgraced soldier, God saw as vessels of grace. And maybe, just maybe, the gate of that prison was never the true lock. Maybe it was pain guilt and the silence we build around trauma, but love, loyalty, and purpose. Those are keys forged not by man but by something divine. Marley didn't just wait, he believed. Ethan didn't just rebuild, he redeemed. That's what miracles look like, not lightning from heaven, but a dog who waits every morning, and a man who chooses to stay and heal others. If that isn't a glimpse of God's hand in our world, then what is? Every day someone near you is carrying an invisible wound. A war in the mind, a storm in the heart. But just as Marley stood by the gate, we are called to stand for one another with patience, with love, with unwavering hope. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs to believe in healing again. Leave a comment below, do you believe in second chances? And if you've ever seen a miracle in your own life, comment, Amen, to honor it. Subscribe to join this journey of compassion. And may God bless every soul who finds strength in stories like this.